Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. I am John Goldberg, and I am the Director of Classical Music here at the Barns of Rose Hill and the conductor of the Rose Hill Chamber Orchestra. I am joined tonight by my lovely daughter, Helena, who maintains a piano and voice studio here in Berryville, and a very special guest, bass virtuoso, Donovan Stokes. Donovan is a professor of bass at Shenandoah Conservatory and is the principal bass of the Rose Hill Chamber Orchestra. Now, before I start, I need to say a word about how I'm coming to you this evening. It is recorded rather than a live stream. Unfortunately, we encountered a great deal of internet issues, and we have been unable to live stream this lecture. And so it's being recorded, and now you can watch it at your leisure. Now, before I start, I have to make a very special thank you to Jim Rose and Susan Watkins. Now, there's a little backstory here. At the annual fundraising event for the Barns last year, we auctioned off me. I was an auction item, giving a special private talk on Beethoven's Ninth. Jim has very generously allowed us to use his talk this evening for our live stream or recorded video on Beethoven's Ninth. But Jim, if you're listening, pick any Beethoven symphony, and I would be more than delighted to come and chat with you and Susan about that work. Now, Beethoven's Ninth, the great choral symphony. So, Beethoven's Ninth, the great choral symphony. When I decided a few weeks ago that I would talk about the Ninth Symphony this evening, I had no idea of the catastrophic events our nation would experience these past 2 weeks. So it is truly with great joy, that's a word you'll hear a lot tonight with this work, joy, that I'm here with you this evening to talk about this particular piece. There has never been written, and there will probably never ever be written, a piece that more affirms humanity. This piece is a triumph of Beethoven's conviction that the solutions to the problems that face humanity lie within our grasp. Beethoven took an old, worn-out Enlightenment model that had long ago exhausted the social and intellectual impulses that gave rise to it. But Beethoven never lost faith in the message. And what was that message? In German, Aller Menschen werden Brüder. All men are brothers. And if we strive to attain that society of all men being brothers, we will experience joy. And Beethoven tells us in this piece that each individual, each person is endowed with the ability to be that agent of change. What better piece is there for this time in America? Now, I didn't come here to deliver a sermon. I came here to talk about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And as you may know, if you heard my lecture on the Eroica, Beethoven is indirected. You must know the end when you start. So I'm going to take a page from Beethoven's book, and we're going to start at the end with that glorious, life-affirming melody, the Ode to Joy. Helena, if you will.
I'd be delighted to. This is the famous Ode to Joy melody, and I think it's important to take a quick second to talk about the words that Beethoven actually scored here. My dad is going to talk about the words and the poem a lot in tonight's lecture, but what I've found as a songwriter and lyricist myself is that one thing Beethoven and I kind of have in common, it seems that he shares this kind of ideal that words aren't just words, that there isn't so much a linguistic meaning as being one half of a whole, the other half being the note itself. So I'm gonna do Beethoven a solid right now. Instead of saying the words, I think that Beethoven wouldn't, if he's anything like me, it's kind of like the nails scraping on a chalkboard kind of feeling. I'd like to say what the words are as I play the melody one time and then continue to play it. So the translation of the words, when you hear this famous melody, is joy, beautiful spark of divinity, daughter of Elysium, heaven. We enter, drunk with fire, passionate. Heavenly One, thy sanctuary. We enter really passionate into heaven. The magic around you binds us. What custom strictly divided, all people become brothers. Where thy gentle wing abides.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Helena. That was wonderful, wonderfully played.
Thank you to Beethoven.
Thank you to Beethoven. I must say that on the way over this evening, Helena asked me, Dad, do you mind if I say a few words or maybe ask you a few questions? And of course I said, fine. So this is not rehearsed, this is not scripted, but I thought it was quite appropriate to quote those words, and I look forward to any contribution you might want to make.
Thanks, Dad.
All right.
I do have a lot of questions here and there.
Okay.
All right.
Maybe I should have gotten them in advance. So a little bit of the lay of the land for the night's lecture. With this ringing in our ears, this glorious melody, this ode to joy ringing in our ears, it's a good place now to stop and step back. And let's talk about the backstory, because the backstory with this piece is very, very important, vitally important. So I'm going to be speaking for a little while before we get back into the music. And then I'm going to touch lightly on the first three movements, because I want to save a lot of time for the fourth movement so I can take advantage of having bass virtuoso Donovan Stokes here to play with us. So here we are in 1800. Beethoven writes his first symphony in C major, 1800. By 1812, he had written his first 8 magnificent pieces, each one a masterpiece. And I'll hear nothing about the 8th. The only bad thing about the 8th is that it came between the 7th and the 9th. It's a masterpiece along with all the other symphonies. From 1812 to 1824, however, Beethoven did not write any orchestral music. So 1800 to 1812, his first 8 symphonies, 1812 to 1824, no orchestral music, and then 1824 we get his magnificent 9th Symphony. I want you to think a minute about 1996, 24 years ago, and where we were technology-wise. Well, we had cell phones, and you could make a cell call if you had if you had a band, if you had a bar rather, you could take a picture, and that would be about it. Of course, we're having internet difficulties tonight, so maybe we have a little bit farther to go. But anyway, our cell phones today give us almost instant access to all the information in the world. Technology has grown by leaps and bounds in just 24 years. Well, Beethoven grew by leaps and bounds from 1800 to 1824. He covered compositionally just as much distance as technology has covered in 24 years. It's amazing. This man never stopped pushing the envelope, never stopped exploring, never stopped trying to expand those classical forms, expand the classical language to accommodate his concepts. Now, from 1800 to 1824, we can see several threads, several strands that ran throughout Beethoven's life, even before 1800, that come to culmination in his Ninth Symphony. Too many for me to talk to you tonight about, but I am going to talk about three of them, three that I think are the most important. And we have to start with the poem, Schiller's Ode to Joy. Schiller penned that poem in 1785. Beethoven was 15 years old. He bought it, hook, line, and sinker. He internalized it. All the ideals that are expressed in that poem became touchstones for Beethoven throughout his entire life. And what are those touchstones in that poem? Well, I can bring it down to two sentences, written by the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant. The starry heavens above us, the moral law within us. Those are the Enlightenment ideals that are so eloquently expressed in this poem. Now, to be truthful, there are 18 stanzas in this poem, and there are a lot of stanzas in this poem that kind of make it sound like a fraternity drinking song, if you will. And that is what it is. Schiller himself rewrote the poem, edited it out later in life, cut out some lines that were typical of that kind of a song. But those driving sentiments are the founding principles of that poem that Beethoven internalized. And let's go into that just a little bit more, because it's so important to understand Beethoven's philosophy and how he applied it to this symphony. When Schiller says the starry heavens above us, in fact, in the poem he says he dwells there beyond the stars. Who is he? God. Beethoven believed in God. To Beethoven, it was almost synonymous with nature. In fact, in his journals, at one point he wrote about his long walks that he would take through the woods in Vienna. And he wrote, everywhere I look, I see God. God and nature were almost one the same. So whether you called him God or Heavenly Father or nature, Beethoven believed in God. He did not believe in dogma. He did not believe in religion, but he certainly believed in God. And he believes, as this poem tells us, that we, through God or through nature, whatever it is, put into the hearts of each of us the ability to create a society where all men are brothers. So from this innate ability given to us from God, we have to act on it ourselves and accept all men as brothers. All you millions be embraced. Embrace you millions. Now, the other interesting thing about this poem, there are a couple of things, is that the word Elysium, it's important to understand that in Beethoven's day, that word, Elysium, would have been translated as universal brotherhood. It did not mean heaven in the Christian sense of heaven, you die and you go to heaven. It was the sense of universal brotherhood, creating that just society right here on earth. And if we attained that society, then we would experience joy. Big word, joy, not the joy of getting your favorite Christmas present, but the all-fulfilling joy of freedom, love, joy. And now what's really interesting is that word joy. There's a lot in this poem that runs through Beethoven's whole life. The word joy. We know that Schiller actually thought maybe of using the word freedom, ode to freedom, Freiheit, instead of Freude. Luckily for us, he chose joy, because it works better, rhythmically it works better with the poem. And in Schiller's day, joy, that big concept joy, did encompass the other areas of liberty, freedom, love, all under the heading of joy. Now let's go forward a few years. Beethoven's going deaf. He's contemplating suicide. I mean, what worse infirmity could a musician have other than going deaf? And he writes what's called the Heiligenstadt Testament. And in this testament, he says, I'm going deaf. I have no reason to live. I cannot find love. Beethoven never found love. He found no love from his parents. In fact, he was abused by his father, neglected by his mother. As a young man, he threw himself at two women who rejected him. I mean, can you hardly blame them? I mean, he was a pretty wild guy. The third woman was unattainable. She was married, and he always conducted himself with honor. So he knew he was never going to find personal love. But in this testament, what he says, if I could find a moment of joy, that word, joy, daughter of Elysium, if I could find a moment of joy, I would have a reason to live. And so luckily for the world, Beethoven came to the conclusion that he would live for his art. And perhaps through his art, he would be afforded that moment of joy. Did he? Well, we'll never know. We can hope that he did, just for what he gave the world, but probably doubtful. In any event, that poem ran throughout his life. As a young man, before he moved from Bonn to Vienna, he thought of setting that poem to music. When he wrote very early on the Leopold Cantata, there are words from that in the Leopold Cantata. There are actually two lines from Schiller's poem in the end of Fidelio, his opera. And there are notes in his sketchbook and in his journals where all through his life he contemplated somehow setting this poem to music. As I said earlier, even after those ideals of that poem had been crushed, after Napoleon had betrayed those ideals, after Napoleon's defeat in the Congress of Vienna had seen wide-sweeping tyrannical governments throughout Europe, Beethoven still held on to that ideal of faith without dogma, society without ideology. Those were his driving principles. Faith without dogma, and society without ideology. And that comes to a head in his Ninth Symphony. Two other threads that won't take quite as long to talk about come to a summation in this work. Throughout his mature period, starting from the middle period, Beethoven's middle period, what we call his heroic period, he was always striving to make the last movement of the piece the most important piece. Previous to this, in most classical symphonies, the last movement of a symphonic work was almost a throwaway movement. The emotional, the musical weight was always on the first movement. Beethoven wanted to move away from that. He was indirected. He was indriven. He always knew where he was going when he started the piece. And he always wanted to make the last movement the most important movement in a symphonic work. Now you could say, well, if you listen to my lecture on the Eroica, well, then he accomplished that in the Eroica. And to my ears, he does. And if there's a little bit of criticism about the Eroica that I can understand, although I don't agree with, there are many scholars who feel that the finale of the Eroica doesn't deliver the payoff that's demanded by the first three movements. I don't agree with that, but I can understand why they may say that. And then you say, well, about his Fifth Symphony, man, what a glorious finale that is. Yes, it's glorious. It's a great piece. It's a big fanfare. It's a big fanfare, the last movement. It's not what Beethoven was really trying to accomplish. But he does finally accomplish this with his Ninth Symphony. One other thread that I think is fascinating. The whole idea of national anthems was sort of new in Beethoven's era. And it can't be denied that he probably felt a little bit of jealousy that a tune by Haydn had become the unofficial national anthem of Vienna. Now, of course, Beethoven revered Haydn. We all know the stories that he studied with Haydn. But there was professional jealousy that a Haydn tune was the national anthem of Vienna. He was well aware of God Save the King in England. And of course, Le Marseillaise, as Napoleon was rising rising through Europe, rising battle after battle, and everybody singing Le Marseillaise about equalité, fraternité, of course, until Napoleon crowns himself emperor, and then you can get sent to jail for singing that national anthem, that anthem about equality, and no, you can't have that when you have an emperor. But the idea of a national anthem really resonated with Beethoven. But this is Beethoven. He wanted to write an anthem without borders, an anthem for humanity, a borderless anthem. And boy, did he achieve that goal. And if I don't talk from these notes, so I don't want to forget to say this because it's so fascinating. In his sketchbooks, there are 200 sketches of the first 8 measures of that Ode to Joy theme before he got it right. 200 sketches for 8 measures. Woo! Thank goodness he didn't stop at 199. That's all I can think. So he did create that national anthem. He did make the last movement the crowning movement of the symphonic work, and he certainly did bring Schiller's Ode to Joy to a magnificent setting that inspires all of us still today. Very inspiring for us today. Okay, so now let's take a look at the music itself. The first movement. I don't want to say anything yet. I want to ask my daughter to play this. Thank you. I want to talk about this a little bit and then let her play it again. What an iconic opening. I mean, just think about it. Bruckner couldn't write a symphony without an opening like that. In fact, 5 of his 9 symphonies open like that. Mahler's first opens like that. Whenever you see a space movie and you want to see the grandeur of space, you hear something like that. This is the void. He starts with the void. You have this, it's almost like a tremolo in the cellos and basses, low. There's no harmony yet. It's really a rhythmical pattern. It's not actually a tremolo. And we're like this. We don't know where it's going. And we start to get these little darts. Ba-da, ba-da. The tremolos rise. The orchestra comes in. Those darts get to be louder and louder and faster and faster. And after a while, it overwhelms us, and it breaks into this brutal. Go ahead. It breaks into this brutal, downward striding, dotted rhythm, militaristic theme. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. He's telling you right now, this is a brutal and despairing movement that's coming up. Now, there was a precedent for this opening. It wasn't unique to Beethoven, unusual, that's for sure, even for its day, unusual. It wasn't unique. Haydn's Creation premiered in 1898, and Beethoven was in the audience for that premiere. Now, Haydn's Creation, if you know it, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, after you hear this, after you've seen the recording, please go and listen to it. It starts with chaos as well. A little different chaos, a little bit different void than Beethoven's, but it's the same principle. That spaciousness, that grandeur, things forming up out of the void, self-creating. With Haydn, that builds and builds and builds, and it bursts into the most glorious, light-filled C major chord you would ever want to hear on the words of "Let There Be Light." Woo, what a difference. Beethoven builds up out of that void and gives us a brutal D minor descending theme. Very different. Very different what the void can create for us. Now, I promised myself that I wasn't going to get too technical tonight, that I was going to not get down into the musical weeds as much as I did with the Eroica, which really needed it. In Beethoven's sketchbooks, actually in one of the longer sketches of the first movement, he actually writes the word despair. So there can be no mistake what he means by this first movement. You know, it's a journey from despair to joy. If you want to know joy, you have to have experienced despair. And Beethoven is not sparing of us. Now, he does give us a little hope, a little brief ray of light with a second theme group that's in a major key in B flat major instead of D minor. Let's hear that. Good, thank you. So he gives us a little brief ray of hope, not much, doesn't spend much time developing it throughout the movement, comes back again very quickly in the recap, but it is enough to say, stick with me, there's hope on the horizon, it's not all brutality and despair, but we will get to the joy. But this movement is... it's churning, it's restless, it's relentless. There is no stability in it. It's this brutal, if it's not brutal, it's despairing. And if there was ever a doubt this is what Beethoven wanted, let's look at the very first chord of the recap. Now let me set this for you. In classical times, classical symphony had the first movement was usually written to a sonata form. Other movements could be too. And it was very typically this way. You had an exposition where the composer gave you two contrasting themes. You had a development section where he shows his genius in developing them. And then you have a recapitulation, which we call a recap, where he brings all those themes back into their home keys. It's sort of a homecoming. And then he wraps it all up in a brief coda, and we're done. So when in this movement, as I'm trying not to get too technical, we can actually see exposition, development, recap. But those lines are blurred. In this movement, there's development from the very beginning. It's almost what I call, it's through composed. There is continual development. But when we get to the recap, and we know where that is, Beethoven, it's the climax of the movement. Beethoven gives us the most terrifying D major chord that you will ever hear until you get to Mahler. Mahler knew how to write a terrifying major chord. This is terrifying. It's very unstable because it's not in root position. That means the D isn't on the bottom. They have sharps on the bottom. So there is that instability, and there's no homecoming here. The recap is supposed to be like a homecoming. We're back into our old keys. Our harmony has been resolved. Nothing's been resolved, and it's just as brutal as the beginnings. Beethoven's saying we're not done. We're not done here. The eeriest part of this whole movement, though, he saves for the end. And I'm sure Donovan knows about the end, because this part starts in the low basses and cellos, very softly. And it's a chromatic, grinding moan. There's no other way to put it. It's a moan. And what does Beethoven do? He floats up. What's that? Let me tell that. She wants to play it. It's so great. I don't blame her. I wish I could play it. On top of that moan, that chromatic moan, he floats a funeral dirge in D minor. Beethoven's third and last funeral dirge. In all his life, he only wrote 3, the one from the Eroica and the one from his Sonata Opus 20, and now this one, his last funeral dirge. He floats that funeral dirge above that moaning chromatic low basses. And that builds, and it builds up till that moan and that funeral dirge just spills over to one last statement of that ba-dum, 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 ba-da-dum. Let's hear that.
Okay.
And once and for all, Beethoven has buried the heroic ideal. It's over. Its time has come. It was betrayed. It's over. The heroic ideal of a benevolent ruler, the philosopher king, who will lead a just society. Napoleon betrayed that ideal, and Beethoven just buried him. He has another ideal for us, and it's coming. Be patient. So, I tell you, you sit through that first movement, and your stomach is just in knots, because it is just despair, brutal. But that's how Beethoven felt. He had to bury his ideal. So now we go to the next movement, the scherzo. Now, some of you may know this is kind of a famous thing, how Beethoven flipped the movements. Typically in a symphonic work, the slow movement comes next, and then you have the scherzo. Beethoven flipped those and has the scherzo second, the slow movement third, and it becomes very obvious why when you hear the whole piece. The slow movement so sets up the last movement. And it's interesting that for the first time, Beethoven doesn't call this movement a scherzo. He doesn't give it that title. He just says allegro vivace, means very, very fast. Vivace, very fast. But it is indeed a scherzo, and when I talk about it, I'm going to refer to it as a scherzo. It's one of those things that scholars like to say, well, he didn't call it a scherzo. You can certainly analyze that movement as a scherzo, as a minuet and trio. You can also analyze it as a sonata form, exposition, development, recapitulation. That's what Beethoven did. He just made hybrid forms while still being respectful of tradition. So this is a very famous moment too, a very famous movement. Before I say much more about it, let's hear this opening.
This is one of my favorite movements of any piece of music ever, and it kind of kills me that I can't play more of it. I'm going to do just this little excerpt. Maybe I'll show a couple little excerpts at the end if we have time.
Okay. Yeah, I know she wants to go on and on and on. A couple of things I want to say about this movement that I think are fascinating. This movement's in D minor. Usually you want the scherzo to be in a major key, bright and dance-like with a lot of buoyancy to it. This movement is in D minor, the same movement, same key as the first movement, but it's not quite that tragic D minor. It's more of a drunken revelry D minor with manic counterpoint. I just made that up. Manic counterpoint. It's driven. It's vivacious in a driven way. Manic. It's what I call a moto perpetuum. It's a perpetual motion, always repeating itself, always repeating itself. Non-stop. You can't stop it once it gets started. You can't stop it. There is a bit of relief, as Beethoven likes to give us a little bit of relief, in what would be called the trio section if you were analyzing this as a minuet and trio, where Beethoven gives us just this delightful sort of peasant tune in a major key, in B flat major, over a drone, and it works. And it's just that moment of, it's not even very long, that moment of relief we need from all that, all that driving, manic music. We get this. Before you know it, we're right back to bum, 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 bum. Now, there are a couple other things about this movement that I find fascinating. If you caught my talk on the Eroica, I talked a lot about how Beethoven manipulates rhythm to drive the piece forward, to add instability, to add unrest. He manipulates the rhythm. But with Beethoven, when he thinks rhythm, he also means silence. Silence is a part of rhythm. You can't have a rhythm unless you have some silence, right? Play just the first 8 measures, please. In the first 8 measures, 4 measures are completely empty. Completely empty. Bump, 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 bump. But our minds keep that line going. Our inner ear in here, bump, 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 keep it going. Beethoven knew how to keep the mind moving even in silence. There's another thing he does rhythmically in this movement that I find fascinating. So this movement is, it's in one, triple meter, so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But there's a 4 measure rhythm laid over that. Bump, I'll do it this way. Bump, 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 bump. See, did I do that? Bump, 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 bump. So every 4 measures is a phrase. Later in this movement, though, he shortens that phrase to three measure phrases, and theorists have a very highfalutin term for this. It's called hyperrhythm. It's sort of like Captain Kirk asking Scotty for warp drive. It just moves, it just like shoots that movement even faster, more maniacal. Beethoven really knew how to use that rhythm to create instability and to add forward motion. And then, of course, if I didn't mention this, somebody's going to write me an email saying, John, you forgot the most important thing about the scherzo, the wild card, the timpani. Where would this piece, this movement be without the timpani? I don't care how many times I've heard this piece, when I get bum 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 bum, you know, that timpani just shakes you. You know it's coming, and still you're just it's like a lightning bolt, like a shock, even though you know it's coming. And Beethoven plays it. I mean, he plays it for all it's worth. The orchestra is written at pianissimo. The timpani is written at forte. You know, he means it to be a shock to you. Never before in a classical symphony has the timpani been used harmonically, melodically, and a point of the form. Timpani players love this. You know, the wild card of the scherzo, the timpani. Okay, let's now go to the third movement. I know I'm moving through these movements rather quickly, but I want to make sure we have a lot of time to spend on the fourth movement. Okay, the third movement. You know, you almost, I run out of words to describe this movement. Beautiful, sublime, universal, time-suspending. All these interdisciplinary words to describe abstract music. It's music that just transports us to a different time. It's Beethoven's musical portrayal of Arcadia. You know, Arcadia is a term that was very familiar in Beethoven's day, and you would translate it as Eden. But they use the term Arcadia. It's Eden. It's man before the fall, before the apple. It's incredibly peaceful, inspiring, fulfilling. It's all these words that there aren't enough words to describe it. You just have to hear it. And even as beautifully as Helena is going to play it, it's not the same as hearing a full orchestra play it. Form-wise, it's what we call a double variation, which is not unique for Beethoven either. Unique for Beethoven. But Haydn wrote a number of works that had a double variation in them, usually in a slow movement. And when Haydn would do a double variation, first of all, a variation is you have a theme and then you write variations on the theme. When you have a double variation, you have two themes. And usually the themes are very differentiated. One theme maybe is bright and cheerful, the other one is maybe more lyrical or maybe in a minor key, very differentiated. With Beethoven, the two themes of this piece, this movement, are very similar. They're in the same place. They're both depictions of Eden, Arcadia, man at his most innocent. The second theme is perhaps a bit more consoling. It has a bit more movement to it. It's not quite as time suspension as the first melody. But these melodies just spin and spin and spin. In fact, Richard Wagner termed these melodies endless melody. I'll butcher it if I try to say it in German, but he called them endless melodies. They just go and go and go. Now, interestingly, here, let's get down the weeds a little bit. How does Beethoven write this endless melody and it not start to get a little boring, a little repetitive, a little static? Well, what he does is vary the phrasing within the melodies. Sometimes it's 3-bar phrases, sometimes it's a 5-bar phrase, or a 4-bar phrase, or a 7-bar phrase. And yet, because of Beethoven's genius, it all sounds organic. It all just sounds like one long phrase. But because of the variation of the parts within that long phrase, we never get tired of it. It never sounds boring or repetitive. Now, interestingly enough, in the midst of all this beauty, sublimity, towards the end, he does give us two fanfare interruptions. Trumpets, drums. This is number 8. They don't last long, these two interruptions, about 2 measures each. And then he goes back into this lovely endless melody. And it's as if he's saying, don't get lost there. Reality is right around the corner. Let's enjoy it while we're here. And then he comes to the end of this movement, and it's like Beethoven doesn't want to say goodbye. He doesn't want to leave it, because he knows we can never go back to it. It goes on far longer than I would think these themes would support going that long. He just doesn't want to leave. And then when he does come to the end, it's what we would call in theory, it's a weak cadence. It's not a strong cadence. It ends mid-measure on a weak beat, on the third beat in a 4-measure phrase. It's like he suspends the motion without completing the movement. He just won't let himself finish it. It's a remarkable moment in a remarkable symphony. Well, we've just closed the door on Eden.
Well, are we closing the door because we never played the themes?
Oh my goodness.
Poor Beethoven.
Poor Beethoven. I'm so glad
Talking
Helena's
about
here.
these 2 themes.
Yes, ma'am. Let's play the 2 themes.
I
And
just wanna-
thank you.
I just want to make an interesting point too, that this is very heavenly, like you're describing, and I think it's very interesting what you're saying about his timing and varying the phrase patterns. And sometimes they're 3 bars, sometimes they're 4 bars, and I think it's interesting. It serves to me a dual purpose. It keeps things moving. It keeps it from being stagnant. But it also kind of creates, I think, a little bit more of that heavenly atmosphere.
Absolutely.
Because I would imagine that Beethoven is kind of making a statement that once we die, that time doesn't really exist.
Good point.
So I hope that I know I'm not the full orchestra, but I hope that I bring it to life a little bit here.
That's theme 1. Then theme 2, you'll see, is maybe a bit more consoling, a little more fluid. Beautiful. And thank you, Helena, for reminding me we need to play this for our folks. So the third movement comes to an end, and we are struck. Can you just play the very opening of the 4th movement? We are
We're ending like that.
yes. So, a couple things I want to say here. We have that gorgeous ending of our evocation of Eden, Arcadia, and then, bam, what Wagner called Schreckenfreude, Schreckenfanfare. Let me get it right. Schrecken fanfare means terror fanfare. And boy, it is a terror fanfare. He is saying, forget it. Eden is over. We can't go back. It's over. It's closed. It's done. We have to find something new. Now, at this point, what I'm going to do is step aside, and I'm going to let Donovan come up here. And Helena and Donovan are going to play the opening of the fourth movement. She set it up for you. You get this terror fanfare, and then the cellos and basses of the orchestra have what we call a recitative. In an opera, a recitative is where a singer stands up and sort of speaks words that in an opera they move the drama along without stopping for an aria. And in fact, Beethoven writes like a recitative. And the basses comment on that terror theme, and then Beethoven gives us snippets of the first three movements, dismissed by the basses, and then finally we get the ode theme. I'm going to ask them to play that, and then I'm going to come up and talk a little more in depth about it, and then I'm going to ask them to play it one more time. stay there. I'll talk on the other side. What a moment. And what, are we okay? I'm checking with our engineer. What a moment in this piece that is. So you're saying, what is Beethoven doing here? Well, he's bringing back those three snippets with the interjections from the cello and the bass. And in Beethoven's sketchbooks, he actually wrote words. He thought maybe he should have the singer sing these words rather than have the basses and cellos play them. And the words after the first one, after that Schrecken fanfare, terror fanfare, was, "No, this chaos reminds us of our despair." These are Beethoven's words. And then after the snippet of the scherzo, Beethoven wrote, "No, not this either. That's only sport. Something more beautiful." And then after the slow movement, the snippet of the slow movement, Beethoven wrote, "Not this either. It's too tender. We must seek something more animated." Then, that's when the winds first come in with that ode theme. The first time we really hear the same, the whole ode theme, although it has been foreshadowed throughout the piece. And then the basses exclaim, "Yes, that's it. Now, I myself will perform it." And the basses and cello come in and play it almost like a prayer. It starts off as a prayer. So, knowing that's what Beethoven was thinking about what this recitative means, and now you know, can I prevail upon the two of you to do it again? Thank you. again, Bob. You must stay here. We don't have much longer because then I want to bring Donovan in for a little Q&A. So what happens next? After the basses play that beautiful theme the first time, Beethoven repeats it 3 more times. The last time it's this grand triumphal march. I mean, it's just so inspiring. You just want to get up and sing because you know the chorus is going to come in a minute. And then Beethoven gives us, once again, the terror fanfare. Da, 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 da. And this time, instead of the basses playing, Beethoven has the bass soloists stand up and echo that phrase, oh, Freud, oh, wish I could be a bass and sing that. And he says, not these tones. And I'll come back to what he means by not these tones. Let us have something more joyful. And he starts with Freude, and the chorus comes in, Freude, and then we're off to the races of Joy, Daughter of Elysium. I don't want to get into the weeds again on the form of this last movement, but I just want to say that many scholars, and I kind of agree with them, see the fourth movement as a miniature symphony. You can divide it into 4 sections, 4 movements of a symphony, all self-contained, or you can analyze it as a sonata form. It really doesn't matter. But what I'm driving at is that what would be the slow section of a symphony, where Beethoven has what I call his credo, the credo from the Mass. The credo is I believe, where you state what I believe, the credo. And in this, he slows it down. He writes this not in a D major, D minor, or B flat, but in Mixolydian, a church mode with the trombones, and it's the theme that accompanies "Embrace You Millions." Okay. You want to play it? This is Beethoven's credo. And while it's not the climax of the piece, it is certainly, it's his belief center. It's the center of his faith at that moment. And what happens next after the end of that credo section is so fantastic, because what he does, he takes the joy theme, bump, but puts it in 3/4 time, and then he puts this theme underneath it, and he has a double fugue. So you have Joy, Daughter of Elysium, underneath Embrace You Millions in Brotherhood. So you have the spiritual theme on top, the humanistic theme on bottom, and he puts them together in this magnificent fugue, joining the spiritual and the humanistic all together in this movement. It's just a magnificent moment. He then goes, he develops that a little bit more, and as we know, he ends with just this burst of jubilation. It's just the most jubilant, exulting ending of any piece I've ever heard. At the end of it, you just want to just jump up and cheer. And I hope you're jumping up and cheering for mankind. And I hope that when people hear this, they go home and they think about the message that Beethoven delivers to us of all men become brothers. Aller Menschen werden Brüder. All men become brothers. And if we do that, we can achieve Elysium, which is universal brotherhood. And if we do that, we will all find joy. We will all find joy. And each one of us has within us what we need to be that agent of change. What a great message for us today. I wish I could live stream a performance of Beethoven's Ninth into every household in America and pray that they accept this message and internalize this message. There's not a greater piece of music written for our time than this. So I'm going to have if you've been with us long enough and you want to go have a drink or get something to eat, I am going to have a little Q&A with my daughter and Donovan. Normally it would have been a little Q&A with you folks, but please stick around. I really want to take advantage of Donovan being here. And I think so often when I'm talking to people after one of our concerts, I've heard how much they would love to meet people, members of the orchestra, but they're tired and they always go home. I don't blame them. So now we have one captive here on stage. So I'm going to kind of think about what you might want to ask Donovan. And so Donovan, I'm going to ask you. You told me earlier this evening that you've played this probably 10 times. What is it like standing at the back of the orchestra? You know this moment's coming. And the conductor turns to you, and man, the spotlight is on you. What does that feel like to play this?
Well, you focus a lot. The tricky part is that every conductor does things a little bit differently, and you have to be able to follow them in that moment. And it's the whole section with the cellos, so you have to sound like one voice.
Right.
And it's all about blending. And but yeah, you're pretty ready. You're on high alert. Although for the entire piece, actually, most of the piece is technically challenging and musically challenging. So you've been on high alert for 40 minutes or something. By the time you get, maybe longer. By the time you get there, so yeah, it takes a great deal of concentration to go from beginning to end, particularly knowing that this is coming. The most nerve-wracking part for me, I think, is actually not the recitative, it's that Ode to Joy theme right after.
Really?
It has to be so smooth and so quiet and
a prayer.
Perfect.
A prayer.
Yeah, and it's a simple melody, but there can be you can't hide any errors or you destroy the musical intent.
Correct, yes. Amazing how Beethoven, I keep going back that it took him 200 tries to get that simple a melody. And he hangs this whole tremendous architecture on this simple melody. It's singable, not like our own national anthem. I love our national anthem, but boy, it can be hard to sing. But this is very singable. It's easy to remember, and it's been estimated that over half the population of the world knows this tune. So it is an anthem for humanity. I do want to ask you another question, though. So you play your recitative and the pressure's off. What do you think when the bass soloist stands up? Are you really, how's he going to do this? Or are you think, it's your turn, buddy?
No, I mean, the singers are obviously much more experienced doing recitative. So, I'm always listening, even though they're not doing it in a recitative manner, I'm always listening to that. There's a lot to learn. I mean, the whole idea is that, we're using an instrument, but it should be like a voice anyway.
Right.
Beethoven's voice.
And but no, I mean, it's also nice to hear, what is a little bit different, because particularly in terms of articulation and maybe phrasing a little bit, and I love it, But that's part of what all men become brothers, right? So maybe the two phrasings are different, but it all sort of works together in one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I did have to cut this a little short because of time constraints, but if you're here on your own time, there was a whole part I left out I'd like to kind of circle back to a little bit. Today we don't realize how Beethoven struggled with two things with this poem. Number one, should he use voices? Should he even do that? And number two, if he's going to use voices, how does he integrate it into the orchestra into the piece so it sounds organic? He struggled with it so much that there's actually a fairly well written out fourth movement without voices that's purely instrumental that he thought about using. Even after this piece was out, he had doubts that maybe he should replace it with the instrumental finale that he wrote. Luckily, he didn't, and that material found its way into his quartet, I think Opus 130 or 132, into a later quartet. So Beethoven, for all his, I don't call him the revolutionary, the evolutionary, for as much as he was expanding classical forms, he was still a traditionalist. And voices aren't used in the symphonic form. If you're going to use voices, you write an opera or you write an oratorio. So he really was conflicted about even using the voice and introducing the voice into a symphonic form. Once he got over that and he was going to do it, Beethoven, everything has to be organic. It has to feel organic. How's he going to do that? Well, this is how he did it. So he has the basses say what he wanted to say musically. Then we have this terra fanfare again, and then the bass soloist stands up and says with words what the bass has said with music. Beethoven is saying that I've reached the limit of what instruments can do. I need the words to make explicit what the instrument had only made implicit. So you get that natural flow. I can't say it anymore with instruments. I need the words to make it explicit, to make sure you understand what I am saying. I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this, but there's music without words is absolute music. I'm not talking about program music like the Vivaldi Seasons or Smetana's The Moldau, but regular music. It's abstract. It's just a note. It only has whatever narrative meaning you put on it. Could be what the composer was thinking, or maybe not. But it's your thought. As soon as you put a word on a note, the word becomes supreme. The word rules. And that F is no longer an F, it's Freude, it's joy. So it moves from the abstract to reality. It's really that word.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's funny. That's what I was saying right at the beginning. I don't know if the word completely obliterates the note itself so much as the note and the word become two halves of a whole. And I think maybe that's why there were 200 sketches. And maybe that's why he did fall in love with this poem at 15 and then wait 24 years later to write it. And I'm fascinated by what happened to him in those 20 years. And at what point did he decide, all right, now's the time when I have to do this. But that's something that I feel a lot of connection with here, is that I think that he was kind of echoing the hero versus humanity with word and musical note as well. That
Sure.
It doesn't just have to be black and white, one or the other, but both are kind of one and the same, and you need both.
Sure.
For it to make sense.
To put across what the poem says to Beethoven.
Right.
What it means to Beethoven.
Right.
Any other questions? Oh, you can't ask. Anything comes to mind you would like to bring up? Point of view of this piece.
I don't think I could say anything more in-depth and eloquent than you have already.
Oh, you're too kind. You're too kind. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and if you're still there, I hope you're safe and that the virus has been far from you. And I hope we can all practice brotherly love and get our country through this moment. Speaking for myself, and I'm sure for Donovan and Helena as well, we can't wait. We can't wait to be back in front of you and having your presence fill this hall. Music is a communal act. Boy, when we're up here performing, we know if you're getting it. We know how it's going over, and we need you as much as we hope you need us. So we can't wait to be back in front of you again. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you again soon.